morena, cielito lindo, vienen bajando. Un par de ojitos negros, cielito lindo, de contrabando. De la Sierra Morena, cielito lindo, vienen bajando. Un par de ojitos negros, cielito lindo, de contrabando. Ay, 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 canta y no llores, porque cantando se alegran, cielito lindo, los corazones.
Cierto en este suelo cubierto de muertos con dignidad. Razón del pueblo profunda, antes que todo se hunda, vamos de nuevo Simón Bolívar, Simón. En el sur la voz amiga es la voz de José Artigas, que también tenía razón.
As a background, I'm just gonna go into this for a bit. Britain had abolished the slave trade in 1807, right? Back in 1787, at this first conjunction, under the the influence of Jefferson, particularly, it was pushed that any new states that were opened up in this Northwest Territory were not to have slavery. That was the agreement. 1788, again, a year after this first Pluto and Saturn conjunction, in France is established the Society of the Friends of the Blacks. Interesting name. Was 1788. Yeah, and like, so there is already this great movement for emancipation, for freedom, liberty, and it was radical. Like, it was seen as these are dangerous radicals. They're going to turn the world upside down, ending slavery. That's fucking madness. But these thinkers, liberal thinkers, the name is going to take on some other connotations that aren't exactly liberal as we go on. But yeah, I just want you to know that from around this time of the first conjunction, emancipation of slavery is already a big thing on the agenda, right? And it's contentious, but by 1807, Britain abolishes the slave trade, right? The U.S. abolishes international slave trade at the same time in 1807. And they start patrolling the waters and arresting slave ships, right? So this is way before Lincoln. Like, it's not like that Lincoln was the first to address the issue of slavery. There were huge movements to be able to end slavery right from around the time of this first Saturn Pluto conjunction. So a point being made, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but like Thomas Jefferson as well, who's one of the drafters, who wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, right? Who becomes the first ambassador to France during the last Saturn and Pluto conjunction. He owned a whole lot of slaves, but he didn't like it. It's a man of contradictions, and I guess like there's a lot of people who are like, oh, what a fucking hypocrite, and to some extent that's. But as the main point is that this has been a huge move towards the abolition of slavery and of freedom and emancipation in general since the last Saturn and Pluto conjunction. So what happens? 1819, we're rolling around to this new conjunction, which we're looking at today, right? There's a bill passed to admit the state of Missouri to the Union. And that comes up before the U.S. House of Reps, and this U.S. rep called James Talmadge, he says, okay, hold on, we're going to make an amendment. These are the conditions to Missouri entering the Union, right? You can enter, you can be part of the United States, Missouri, but here's the thing. After the bill is passed, no more slaves. Introduced anyway. You can't bring any more slaves in. And after we pass this bill and you become part of the United States, Missouri, every slave child that is born from that time onwards, by the time they get 25, then they're free automatically. And this gets passed. This gets passed in the U.S. House of Reps, goes to the Senate, and what happens? The Senate is like, oh, fuck no, and they reject it, and the whole motion fails. And it's like this stalemate with what are we going to do with Missouri? Missouri wants to join. It's a slave state. We don't want, to keep promoting slavery in these new territories. And the South wants to maintain their right to be able to do it. So it creates a conflict. This conflict is going on throughout the whole year of this tight spot of the conjunction, when Saturn is within 2.6 degrees of Pluto. They end up, the next year, beginning of 1820, they come up with, the situation again. The House of Reps does the same thing. They submit a bill with the same conditions, and there's a stalemate again. The Senate won't pass it, and this is mainly because of wanting to keep this balance between free states and slave states, representation. The problem is that at that time, in December of 1819, during this conjunction as well, Alabama becomes part of the Union, and they're a slave state, right? So when Missouri, as it's called, I had to say that at least once, Missouri. When Missouri applies again in 1820, there's a balance there between free states and slave states. But the problem is that Maine comes up again, and they want to apply as a free state. And problem is then you're going to have one more free state than slave states, and the slave states don't like this. So they come to an agreement, right? They draw a line. They draw this line. So the line is on the parallel, the 36 degrees and 30 minutes parallel, straight across America. And they say, okay, north of this line, no more slavery, right? Like any new states that are created in this territory north of this line, no slavery, except with the exception of Missouri. They get to remain a free state, but they're the only they're the only slave state north of this line, and this is known as the Missouri Compromise, right? And it's basically, it sets up the run-up to the American Civil War. They basically agree to disagree on the issue of slavery, but this sort of festers and simmers like a, festers like a wound, simmers like a, like a sort of cauldron of kind of like witch's brew that nobody wants to look at, like this issue with the past in the nation of the free, with this forward thinking vision of the, of the founding fathers. I mean, Jefferson drafting the Declaration of Independence that they fought for. All men are created equal. Point of that as well, like, extending to women, that's another point, but I'm noting that just as well to be fair. Look into it yourself. There was, I think, Simone Beauvoir, if I'm right, was in France, actually created a Declaration of the Rights of Women, amongst other things, including that is she actually ended up freaking dying, being killed. Correct me if I'm wrong, seriously, but I'm recalling this just straight from memory. So yeah, so this is the major thing, the Missouri Compromise, and this division between the free states of the North and the slave states in the South. Interestingly enough, at that time, I was reading, sorry, I'm trying to think whether or not to go into this. Interestingly enough, apparently, only the state of Carolina was really vocal about coming up and making moral arguments in defense of slavery. And no, slavery's a good thing, and the others were sort of like, oh, that's embarrassing. Even the slave states in the South were just sort of kept quiet. And it at this stage, it was sort of, it was like a sort of dirty subject. They wanted to retain slavery, but they sort of, they realized it wasn't in the vision of the the forward thinking vision of the American United States. But yeah, out of this, once we come out to the next conjunction and we see the crisis re-erupt, then you start to get a whole lot of those other southern states actually making moral arguments for slavery, saying, no, it's a good thing. It's morally it's grounded. God wanted slavery to exist. It's righteous. It's upright. We take care of our slaves. They can't take care of themselves. They'll end up in jail, things like this. So yeah, fucked up, but at this stage, even then, even for a lot of the southern states, there is this implication that they want to keep slavery, but they realize it's sort of a backward thing and not in the vision of the United States. So I guess that's it on that point. That's one major thing I want to look at, and I'm sort of building this whole thing to look at the idea of the destruction of boundaries and the destruction of old laws, right? Because Saturn is law and Pluto is destruction, to put it very simply in a nutshell. I'm going to get onto this a bit later, I promise. Some of you have said, look, why don't you get more into the astrology? I've already explained why that I'm leaving that off for a bit for those who are skeptical of astrology, trying to be fair to everyone. So yeah, like, liberty, the breaking of the rules in order to bring in a greater amount of light, for a wider vision of what human existence is, basically. Like Pluto is the soul. It's soul power. It transcends and shatters the limits of the tiny little me, my, mine, that little lowercase I, which serves its function. But, when it's the myopic center of all human existence and planning, it ends up being overly restrictive. And any fresh impulse that has brought greater liberty, greater inspiration, greater flourishing of human culture throughout history has been able to look beyond that, smaller, tiny, egotistical viewpoint of just looking at one generation or one person or one group of people, and looking at, what has been called the human soul, right? Psychology, study of the soul, really starts to have a grounding around the time when Pluto is discovered, right? So we're going to get to that as well. But yeah, for the moment, Saturn is the past. Saturn is rules, structures, law, tradition, to do with work as well, particularly hard work. Obviously, slavery and serfdom have got a lot to do with that. And then Pluto is, this this boundary shatterer on the edge of the solar system. We don't know whether or not that it's a planet or not, that we've been debating recently. It's the last stop before we leave the Kuiper belt, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, into the greater galaxy, yeah? And Pluto, interesting because it's so tiny, but it packs a punch, and it's sort of showing that, like, yeah, your real self, what you consider to be packed into this tiny little personality, is much greater. Your consciousness is the consciousness of humanity, which by extension is the consciousness, of mammals, of animals, of plants, of the rocks, consciousness of the planet. We're going into galactic consciousness, right? Like we were looking at that last time with Herschel and the telescopes that he was just sending out everywhere, and this huge telescope that he was building, and how that became a thing that was really in the hands of the public, from then on. So yeah, bit of an astrology thing there for those of you who have been pressing me to go into it. But yeah, like we're really looking at freedom here now. We've seen that in relation to the serfdom in Russia. We've seen how since the last conjunction, like there's this huge push for the abolition of slavery, and now we're seeing the ground laid, like, the line drawn in the sand, almost literally in the new United States. Moving on. I'll talk about it for ages. I hope the point's clear. 26 minutes. Fuck. Okay. Stop swearing, Mark. Slavery. Cool. Done. I'm pretty sure we looked into Antarctica. The Russians discover Antarctica in 1820. I'll come back to that a bit before, but yeah. Before they get to that, Australia gets called Australia. Because they're like, they gave up on Antarctica at this point and thought, well, fuck it. There's no great southern continent more south than Australia. Let's just give the title to Australia. And then, like, a couple of years later, the Russians come in and discover Antarctica. So, yeah, that happens as well. I mean, huge shifting point as far as boundary dissolution, wider vision, like in regards to Antarctica that we're looking at here. Gasworks, we looked at last time. We're talking about balloons, and how that came into the coal gas, experiments with coal gas, the coal industry starting to come in, the introduction of these great machines. Industrial weaving, industrial agricultural threshing, and as well the first public presentation of an industrial steam engine supporting a vehicle, so steam powered vehicle at the last conjunction. Um, and yeah, coal gas that was first used. By this time, it's still sort of limited to Britain, but there are like thousands of homes and buildings that are being illuminated through coal gas being pumped through pipes into these great gas works. Cue a picture here. So you can see, yeah, sort of. This is around 1820, 1821. These are the start of these big gas power plants that are being fueled with coal, to power, to illuminate, to heat, everyday houses as well as factories and machines and all of this. So, this is a big booster for coal. That's another thing that really takes a turn around this time. Look into it, 1819, 1820. And for instance, it's also like, just to start, it's when the streets of Paris began to be illuminated by coal gas lamps, and Paris becomes the city of lights. I mentioned that in the last one, but yeah, this is at this conjunction. So, all right, break for a little bit, a few seconds. Yeah, liberty, soul unity, transformation, regeneration, death and rebirth. I sort of went into that. All right. The Peterloo Massacre. This is in Manchester. Happens in 1819. So they had the bicentenary of this recently, actually. You can look into it. So this is in England, Manchester, England, and yeah, generally the background for this is that after Napoleon's defeated and the Napoleonic Wars are ended, there's a whole lot of like grain prices, imported grain. The prices on that just plummets, right? So England is able to import a whole lot of cheap grain, yeah. And for the average people, this is cool because they can afford to eat and actually maybe save a bit for the working class, right? Um, but again, the wealthy, the merchants, the bankers, the industrialists who are in control of the government, um, they don't like this, and they bring in the corn laws, right? So the corn laws applying to grain in general, um, they impose heavy tariffs, duties on all imported grain, so that they force the price of bread up, to force the poor to have to buy the local bread, to give the money to local, industry barons and landholders, um, and yeah, fucks with them, man, because it's like they have to buy the more expensive bread when they're already poor already, right? These are the people who are working in their fields, in their factories, more so now because these machines are taking over a whole lot of things. And the people, sure, they want to voice their upset at this, but there's no representation. Well, there is representation, right? But at the moment, it's restricted to adult males. Yeah, and not only you had to be an adult male to be able to vote, right? But you had to own land, and not just you had to own land, but you had to own land of a certain rental value. If it was below that, no, you weren't considered to be worthy of political representation and voting. Yeah. Um, so this is the kind of liberalism that they had at that point in time. Again, looking at the idea of how, what has been called liberal or free, or people who are supporting freedom are actually only really looking at freedom for the upper classes, freedom for the industry barons, freedom for the rich to be able to buy and sell and trade, while just walking all over everyone else. So yeah, that's important to note. But yeah, so in Manchester, the people are they're really quite upset. Like throughout a whole lot of of England as well at this situation. Um, and yeah, not only that, like they have to when they go to vote, um, it's not a secret ballot. They have to travel to Lancaster, um, and then they have to publicly declare who they're voting for. In public. Um, After traveling for a shitload of time, like when they're working men that have got families and things like that. So yeah, apart from that, then there's this ridiculous state of representation anyway, right? So for instance, there are for the urban center of Manchester and the whole of the surrounding urban areas, you had two representatives in Parliament, two representatives for around 1 million people, right? And then you had areas which are like known as the rotten boroughs, right, which needed reform. For instance, one family, the Treby family of about 40 voters, had one MP to represent them. Um, and then in the borough or the district, the voting electorate of Old Sarum, there were seven voters, right? Seven voters in that electorate. They got one MP to represent seven, and meanwhile, you've got in Manchester, you've got one MP for 500,000. So the whole system is just completely unfair, and people start to gather, and they gather together in this place called Peter's Field in Manchester. There's a monument there today, and about 50, 60,000 people are gathering to protest, the injustice, protest against these corn laws, which are causing people to starve and people to, be thrown out of their homes, to be thrown into abject poverty. Yeah. So, and the short of it is, what happens is the upper classes who are in control of the government, they're like, no, send in the cavalry, and the cavalry come in and they just charge on this crowd of about 50, 60,000. Heaps of people are injured. The first person to get injured, I think, is a woman and child, and get knocked to the ground. It's horrific. Like 18 people are killed, and many more are injured. And after this protest, um, it's a huge marking point, because then the British government brings in these 6 acts, right? And they basically clamp down. So we're looking at the old school regressive Saturn that's coming in here, that's cramping down on the laws, trying to reinforce the old order. And yeah, so these are the things they make a law to these 6 acts. They make a law to rush in to people's houses, break in, seize any weapons that are there, and arrest the owners of those weapons. They make it illegal to meet with of anything around of a military nature. You'll immediately be arrested, and you will be transported to the colonies. So most likely Australia, you'll become a convict. If you're in a meeting that they deem to be training, in a military way. Bail gets limited, so very, very hard to get bail if you're charged, and they speed up the court processing time, so you don't get much time at all to be able to prepare a defense for yourself. Just thrown into jail or onto the ship to be sent to Australia. Meetings of more than 50 people are declared illegal unless you get permission from the sheriff, right? So you have to ask permission to have a meeting if it's to do with matters of church and state. So basically, if there's more than 50 people discussing religious or politics, and you haven't asked permission off the government, off the police, if that's okay to do, then you're illegal, and you're going to get locked up and probably sent to Australia for sedition as well. Yeah, a law against blasphemous and seditious libel. So again, talking against the church, talking against the state. That gets brought in for all of the press. So they stamp out the free press. Seeing this again now as we're in this current Saturn Pluto conjunction. They're stamping out the free press. What do you get for this, right? The penalty for this is 14 years transportation. So 14 years a convict in Australia. That's the maximum that you can get now for publishing anything that they deem to be critical of the government or of the church. Yeah, that comes out of this this protest and the massacre of people who were, angry, but peacefully protesting, in 1819. Um, and then other publications, right? So other publications that maybe escape because they're not explicitly seditious or blasphemous. Um, Even if they escape, what they do is they put a huge stamp duty on it. So they increase the cost of production, means that the cost of, some papers and what we'd call today as zines, like free magazines, free press to distribute to people like we'd get on the internet today. It's equivalent of shutting down free news sites that are giving alternative news. It's how we would see it if they did that. Um, so yeah, um, huge attack on the press, huge attack on the right to assemble in public, to discuss matters of state and religion openly, and yeah, and just like clamping down on harsh penalties. That's what comes out of people that are saying, hey, like, we're not being fairly represented, in with all of this talk of freedom and democracy. Um, and yeah, like, stop fucking increasing the price of bread while we starve. Like, that's fucking cruel and inhumane, right? Like, so we're gonna start to see these kind of protests and start to emerge. I won't go into it now, but we see this grow. We see this grow out of you know, the birth of the coal industry, along with these machines that we saw from the first conjunction. Now we're seeing the effects of this kind of thing come in, with people being ripped off the land, pushed into urban centers, treated like shit, artificially increasing the price of basic bread whilst they slave away in the factories. This is what's coming around with this age of coal, with all of the great technology and these advances in this year, for instance, is the first time that a steam powered boat crosses the Atlantic. Yeah, it had sails with it as well, but for a good technically it was a steam powered boat, right? It used steam power. This is a world first. These are great technological advances, and then the dark side of it is that you get shit like this, and when the people stand up and go, hey, we're being left out in this whole fucking new world, what happens? They send in the cavalry and they fucking kill people, and then they increase, draconian laws, to repress free speech and repress the right to assemble, and to hold back, this rollout of freedom. Like, oh, whoa, too much here, just freedom and democracy for just me and a few of my friends. We'll deal with it. You don't know how to handle it, right? So again, this is coming up, right? This push for a greater vision of humanity, a greater vision of the self, and the nature of the human soul, right? Versus Saturn, with this sort of like slow moving, holding on to the past, like rules, regulations, structure, limitation. To be fair on old Saturn as well, on old Father Time, he has his place. And really, the good side of Saturn in this is that what we're seeing is new laws are being established. So there's a difference between freedom and licentiousness, right? Like some people just get those two things confused a lot of the time. They think freedom just means, oh, well, you can't just have freedom because freedom means people will just go out and fucking kill people and, like rape each other and just fucking do the most horrible shit. That's just more complete license to do anything. Like freedom is really essentially more of a transcendent concept that is inspired by a vision akin to the human soul, right? If you're really anti-religious or not religious or what, or very very secular, sort of like um, skeptical, rational, whatever, like those kind of things. Cool. If you don't like the word soul, I mean, just look at it from a clinical sense from psychology, which is looking at, it's the scientific study of the soul, suke. If you want to look at it like that, then sure, as long as you understand this whole idea of liberty of consciousness, particularly, and this emphasis of consciousness expansion beyond the little self, beyond the little region, beyond the little group of people who are in control and who have the right to decide for everyone else. This is where we're getting at with Pluto working together with Saturn, right? So yeah, have structure, have rules, but it's like, well, we need to smash down a whole lot of these old rules and restructure it so that we can take a wider vision of the soul that's appropriate for this time, and this greater generation, right? So cool. Yeah, so that's what's happening 18, 19, 80, 20. What was planted through the last conjunction is now coming to its cycle and building into a whole new implantation of new wider concepts. It's causing another crisis, right? We looked at Antarctica, that those kind of expansion of boundaries. We looked at the gasworks. We looked at how the streets are getting illuminated. It's not completely right there yet, but the coal industry is coming in and bringing light and heat and cooking power and stuff to more and more people in their homes. So when we're in now, we're really in the romantic era. I won't go into that so much, but yeah, like as I'm saying, 1820, the lights of Paris start to get lit, and Paris, the city of love, gay Paris, the city of lights. This idea of romance starts to come in now with this idea of freedom, right? Because actually before then, the idea of of marriage out of love was something seen as almost like a fantasy, and some people might still say today that it is, right? Like as far as fairy tales, Disney fairy tales, sort of like all of that stuff. But yeah, but the idea of marrying for love and out of freedom rather than having an arranged marriage by your family for political interests, that was something which was spreading and was seen as radical at the time. So these ideas of breaking with tradition, of seeing a vision of the wider human consciousness, to identify with a wider and wider group of humanity as a whole, is what's coming in here. I wrote that Pluto brings recognition of the narrow-mindedness of the short-sighted personality, which only sees things in terms of this lifetime, right? Of its own parochial culture, immediate surroundings, and so on. So Pluto dissolves the mask, the persona, out of which we get personality. The personality and persona it's important. I struggle with this a little bit in social situations. I find it hard to make small talk. As you might gather out of a post for 49 something minutes already about this. Yeah, I do, and I'm still learning on that. But yeah, the persona is important. you can't just delve into matters of deep psychology and the soul and, you know, esoteric like discussion um around most people and things like that. Even sort of like talking about history or things like this, like people want to discuss like My Kitchen Rules or The Bachelorette or whatever, and I'm not completely shitting on that. I reckon it's fucking atrocious, but yeah, look, you know, like there's that part of me which is the persona that will even watch a little bit of it just to sort of pay it out. And I've heard that that's one of the excuses that people give for actually giving time to this shit. But anyway, um, yeah. So I guess like I'll sort of wrap it up as a roll up towards the period. A few years after this 1819-1820 conjunction, uh, you've got basically independent Mexico, right? And at this time, that's stretching throughout most of the United States. Like it's like including Texas, right? Like the Texan territory. And the Mexicans actually invite American settlers in to help them protect them against the indigenous people of North America, who are sort of, you know, getting really shitty about this increased expansionism and are making raids, right? So the Mexicans invite the Americans into Texas, and you know, like as I guess we'll go into a bit more next time, but this happens in the next few years after this conjunction. The Americans start to get stroppy, sort of like, well, yeah, we're the Anglos, like, you know, like we can work with you, but yeah, you're not exactly like the you know, like the Indians, like you're not that wild, but you're still, you know, like you're Latins, right? And again, we're seeing a lot of this prejudice, still the seeds of it happening today. What comes out of this, you know, this great revolutionary force through Latin America, that is really at quite a shifting point with Simon Bolivar. Haven't really gone into much, but with the independence of Mexico from the Spanish. What happens from that point is quite a sad story, and it shows basically the American settlers coming in, working with the Mexicans at first, but then, you know, a lot of betrayal goes on, and by the time we get to the next conjunction, that's when they've gone in and they've invaded and taken California off Mexico. So, you know, California, Texas, whereas, you know, Arizona, New Mexico, a lot of these American states were originally part of Mexico. And when they came in and conquered it, they gave the Mexican citizens there the right to become American citizens. Yeah, after they'd taken their country. So sort of cruelly ironic that we're looking at the moment with, you know, a whole lot of Mexican Americans uh, who are in what was, you know, what was Mexico for the greater part of the 19th century, during this conjunction and for decades beyond that, um, being deported out of places like Texas and out of Arizona, out of Las Vegas, Nevada, out of California, right? Um, Being deported these days, you know, when it would be before, it was like they were giving them American citizenship, and I mean that's the very freaking least that they could do. But yeah, there's a whole lot of dark side that we really emerges out of here as we see that freedom, liberty, the whole rush from the American and French revolutions and this free thought and all of this that's been spreading since this first conjunction that we looked at, 1786, 1787, and you know, the new world of machines and telescopes peering deep into the galaxy, and you know, the discovery of Antarctica, um, all of these things that are really forward, exciting, future-looking movements. excuse me, there's this great excitement that spreads, and it spreads really quickly in South America. Again, anyway, new to this thing, please help me out, make it a group project. If you want to correct me on anything, or if you want to add anything else that you can see that's happened around 1819 or 1820 or related to events at that time, by extension, give or take a year or a bit more, go ahead. Again, I've focused on this very narrow point in time to really take a good look at this conjunction. And I'm going to come up with another video soon, because we are getting really close. I mean, we are in this conjunction right now, and I do really want to talk about the effects that it's having at the moment. But I hope that you're able to take away from this video, through the historical context, general themes of what has been happening, and realize that if this is true to form, that we are seeing quite a momentous key point, because they exist. Big shifting points in history do exist, and we've been looking at some of them. We're in one right now. So adios, and until next time. Yeah, something funny to say. Think of it. I don't have a catchphrase yet. See ya.
La hierba de los caminos la pisan los caminantes. La hierba de los caminos la pisan los caminantes. Y a la mujer del obrero la pisan 4 tunantes de esos que tienen dinero. Y a la mujer del obrero la pisan 4 tunantes de esos que tienen dinero. ¿Qué culpa tiene el tomate que está tranquilo en la mata? ¿Qué culpa tiene el tomate que está tranquilo en la mata? Y viene un hijo de puta y lo mete en una lata y lo manda pa' Caracas. Y viene un hijo de puta y lo mete en una lata y lo manda pa' Caracas. Los señores de la mina han comprado una romana. Los señores de la mina han comprado una romana para pesar el dinero que toditas las semanas le roban al pobre obrero. Para pesar el dinero que toditas las semanas le roban al pobre obrero. Cuando querrá el Dios del cielo que la tortilla se vuelva. Cuando querrá el Dios del cielo que la tortilla se vuelva. Que la tortilla se vuelva, que los pobres coman pan y los ricos mierda, mierda. Que la tortilla se vuelva, que los pobres coman pan y los ricos mierda, mierda. Que la tortilla se vuelva, que los pobres coman pan y los ricos mierda, mierda.